The drill stopped at a 347 hours ship time. Mara Solis heard it happen the way you hear a heart monitor go flat, not as a sound ending but as a silence beginning. She was 3 levels below the surface of Kareth 9, sitting in the portable lab with her coffee gone cold and her spectrometer still blinking through the last analysis, when the percussion of the borer, that constant, bone-deep hammer that had been the rhythm of her life for 11 months, simply ceased. She looked up from her work. She listened to the silence for 3 full seconds. Then she pulled on her suit jacket, clipped her sample kit to her belt, and walked toward the access shaft without hurrying, because hurrying underground was how people died. The surface was wrong. Not wrong in the way a malfunction is wrong, not the oily wrongness of broken equipment, but wrong the way a room is wrong when someone has moved everything 6 centimeters to the left while you slept. The drilling platform stood where it had always stood. The equipment was intact. The crew of 7 was standing in a loose, silent cluster about 40 meters from the bore head, facing outward, and none of them were talking. Her site foreman, Declan Okafor, had his helmet visor down even though the atmosphere of Kareth 9 was breathable. He always took his helmet off at surface. He said it made him feel less like cargo. Mara walked past the equipment. She walked past the crew. She stood beside Declan and followed the direction of his visor. The horizon was full of ships. Not the distant smear of running lights that passed through the system every few months. Registry lights from the transit corridor that sometimes made the newer technicians stop and stare. Before the veterans explained that traffic this far out moved mostly dark, and what they were seeing was automated freighters doing nothing interesting. This was different. These were stationary. They sat at roughly 2 kilometers altitude in a ring that extended, as far as she could estimate, around the entire excavation site. She counted 31 before she lost count of the shapes against the early morning sky, and she understood with the calm certainty of someone who has spent 11 months in deep geological study that 31 was not the whole number. "When did they arrive?" she said. "About 12 minutes ago." Declan's voice was flat, not afraid, not calm either. Somewhere in the space between those two things where you go when your body is given up deciding. "Has anyone called the relay station?" The relay isn't answering. She stood there for a moment. Above them, the ships held their positions with a steadiness that no human vessel managed at that altitude. No thruster wash, no corrective drift, just stillness. They were dark-hulled and large. The largest she could see was perhaps 400 meters along its longest axis, which was enough to be a colony ship or a heavy carrier or something, with no human category at all. "All right," she said. She went back to the lab. The spectrometer was still running. She pulled up the last 18 hours of analysis. The bore had been cutting through a stratum of compressed silicate and carbon that had initially read as unremarkable, the kind of geological layer you found in the lower bands of tectonically stable worlds, old and dense, and without the chemical signatures that made it interesting to anyone except someone who studied planetary formation the way some people studied languages, because geological strata were languages, were records, were testimony. You just had to know how to read them. Mara had been reading rock for 22 years. The stratum they had been cutting through was not unremarkable. She understood this now, looking at the data she had been too close to see clearly, the way you cannot read a sign by pressing your nose against it. The carbon ratios were wrong for natural compression. The silicate crystalline structure had regularity that didn't come from pressure and time alone. Scattered through the last 400 meters of core sample were isotopic signatures she had cataloged as anomalous, and flagged for further analysis, and then gotten busy with the extraction schedule, and not returned to. And now, looking at the totality of what she had been pulling out of the ground of Kareth 9, Mara Solis put her hand flat on the lab table and felt something open up in her chest that was not quite fear, and was not quite wonder, but was the collision of both. The rock remembered, not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that all geology was the memory of time, literally. The stratum they were drilling through was structured data, compressed, isotopically encoded, laid down in deliberate layers of increasing density the way you would construct a storage medium that needed to survive tectonic events, stellar evolution, the ordinary violence of deep time. She had been pulling terabytes of it out of the ground and processing the rock as aggregate, and she had been reading it as noise, because she hadn't understood what she was reading. It was an archive. She sat with this for 45 seconds. 45 seconds was a long time, given the ships on the horizon. But she was the kind of person who needed to be certain before she moved. Because moving wrong in geological work meant cave-ins and deaths and the loss of irreplaceable data, and she had learned patience not as a virtue but as a survival mechanism. When the 45 seconds were done, she picked up her comm and called the one person on the extraction team she trusted to hear this without either panicking or dismissing her. "Reyes," she said when he answered. "I need you in the lab." Tomas Reyes was her second in charge of analysis, which meant he had the same credentials she did, and about half the field experience and twice the mathematical intuition. And when she walked him through the data, he said nothing for a long time, and then said, "The crystalline nodes. Yes. I thought those were pressure artifacts. So did I." He pulled up the three-dimensional mapping of the bore sample and rotated it slowly. The nodes distributed through the stratum formed a pattern that was not obvious until you knew to look for it, at which point it was obvious the way all the best things were obvious, unavoidably and completely. How far down does this go? We don't know. We've been cutting through it for 400 meters. The initial survey gave this stratum a depth of roughly 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers of. He started again. Of what? Of records? Of data? Of something. Yes. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, because she had felt it on her own face in the last hour. The expression of a person whose professional framework for understanding the world has just shifted one tectonic plate to the left. "The ships," he said. "I think so. They're waiting for us to. I don't know what they're waiting for. But you have a theory." She did. It was not a comfortable theory. It was the kind of theory that arrives when you put together a set of facts that each individually feel manageable, and then realize that the thing they describe together is not manageable at all, is in fact the largest thing you have ever stood in the presence of. "I think we drilled into something that matters to them," she said. "And I think they stopped us. And I think that if we do nothing else, if we just stay here and do nothing, eventually they'll decide we were either malicious or stupid and act accordingly." She paused. "I'd rather they knew we were neither." Reyes looked at the data, he looked at her. "You want to try to read it? I want to try to show them we can." The first problem was time. They had no way to estimate how long the ships would wait before doing whatever ships of that size did to an extraction site that had been drilling into something sacred or classified or irreplaceable. The second problem was methodology. The encoding they were looking at was nothing she had been trained to read. It was alien cryptography written in isotope ratios and crystalline lattice arrangements, and she had maybe 12 hours of battery in the portable lab, possibly 20 if she was careful, and no guarantee that anything she produced would be legible to whatever intelligence had written the archive in the first place. The third problem was Superintendent Halverson. He arrived at the lab with Declan 20 minutes after she had called Reyes, and he was carrying the kind of controlled fury that administrative men carry when events have stopped following the schedule. He was a good man, Halverson. Careful with the extraction licenses, fair about hazard pay, the kind of manager who remembered the names of everyone's families back home. None of those qualities were useful right now. "We need to evacuate," he said. "No, Dr. Solis. If we move toward the shuttles, they'll take it as a run. Either they let us go and we never understand what we found here, or they don't let us go." She kept her eyes on the spectrometer display. "I'm not interested in either of those outcomes." "You're not interested." His voice had gone up slightly. "There are 31 ships, at least 53, based on the signatures I'm picking up from over the ridge," Reyes said, not looking up from his own screen. "The ones we can see are the ones they want us to see." The silence that followed this had a specific quality. Mara had heard it before, early in her career, at a site in the Kepler belt, where a survey team had broken into a void chamber, and the air had moved in the wrong direction, and everyone had understood simultaneously that the geometry of the situation had changed. It was the silence of recalibration. Halverson sat down on one of the equipment cases. He put his hands on his knees. He breathed for a moment. "What do you need?" he said. This was why she liked him. What she needed was everything she had. She pulled every core sample from the storage lockers and had Reyes run them through the full spectroscopic battery while she worked on the computational model for the encoding. The crystalline nodes operated on a principle she kept thinking of as layered witness. Because each node contained information about the nodes around it, a distributed redundancy that meant you could read any fragment and derive the structure of the whole, the way you could derive the shape of a coastline from a single handful of sand. It was elegant in a way that made her hands shake slightly while she worked. Not from fear, but from the specific emotion she had felt 3 times in her career. the emotion of encountering something that deserved reverence. The other crew members came in and out of the lab. Declan organized watches. Someone made food that mostly went uneaten. The ships did not move. By hour 6 she had a partial translation framework. It was rough and she was not certain of it. And she told Reyes so. And Reyes told her that rough and uncertain was the best they were going to get in 6 hours working with equipment designed for mineral assay. And she agreed. The archive was not a message. It was not addressed to anyone. It was a record of something, she thought, working carefully through the isotopic language, a record of worlds, of planets as they had been before they were what they currently were. Stratum by stratum, Kareth 9 had been documented in geological intervals, going back approximately 900 million years. Events, changes: the arrival of liquid water, its loss, the formation of this particular valley, the deposition of this particular stratum in an era when the atmosphere had been thicker and the mineral chemistry had been different. She thought, they wrote the planet down. They made a copy of it in its own stone. They wrote the planet into itself, the way you press a seal into wax. And they've been keeping this record for 900 million years. And we drilled through 400 meters of it without noticing. She put her face in her hands for a moment, just a moment. You all right? Reyes asked. Yes. She sat up. Can you encode a response in the medium they're using? I need a very simple message. He looked at the equipment. In rock? In core sample. What we've pulled up is still usable as a medium. The structure is damaged from extraction, but the base material is intact. If I can encode in the same isotopic language, we don't have the equipment to do that kind of precise isotopic manipulation. We have the drilling laser array. We have the mass spectrometry calibration tools. We have, she thought. She calculated. She had been calculating all her life, not with numbers primarily, but with what was possible given what was present. And what was present on an extraction site in the outer system was a great deal of heavy equipment designed to do very precise things to very hard material. We have enough. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. He was 29 years old, and he had followed her to 3 of the most remote extraction sites in the frontier zone, because she had a reputation for finding things that weren't in the survey projections. And he had never until this moment understood what that reputation actually meant, what kind of mind it required. He could see him understanding it now. What's the message, he said. She thought about this carefully, because it was the most important thing she would ever say, and she had the vocabulary of a language she had deciphered in 6 hours. And she had one chance. She wrote, we did not know, we are reading, we will stop 3 sentences. She encoded them in the same isotopic lattice structure the archive used, stamped into the upper layer of a core sample section, and then, because she needed them to see it, because the whole point was that it had to be visible and legible and unmistakably deliberate. She brought the core sample to the surface herself, walked to the halfway point between the lab and the nearest ship, and set it on the ground. Then she stood next to it. Declan appeared at her shoulder after about 40 seconds. He didn't say anything, he just stood there. Reyes came out and stood on her other side. Halverson came next, and then the 7 members of the crew one by one until all of them were standing in a line in the open, unarmed, in the particular morning light of Kareth 9, which was amber and long, and came in at a low angle that made every shadow stretch out behind them, like dark attendants. Nothing happened for 6 minutes. Then one of the ships descended. It came down slowly, with the same uncanny stillness the others maintained on the horizon, dropping from 2 kilometers to 50 meters, in a motion that had no identifiable mechanism, no thrust wash, no heat signature her suit sensors could detect. It was roughly the size of a large building laid on its side. Its hull was dark and non-reflective, and had a texture that she would later try to describe and fail, settling eventually on the approximation that it looked like compressed geological strata, which she's understood in retrospect was probably not a coincidence. A section of the hull opened. What came out was not what human science fiction had prepared anyone for, and was also in the way of all genuine discoveries. Exactly right. 4 of them. Roughly bipedal, but the word bipedal flattened what she was actually seeing the way the word blue flattens a sunset. They moved with a fluidity that suggested their skeletal structure was arranged differently than anything terrestrial. Their coloring was the deep gray-brown of old basalt. Their faces, if she was reading faces correctly, were oriented toward the ground, more than toward the horizon, which she thought was significant. Their eyes, when she could see them, caught light, the way mineral inclusions catch light in cross-section, a flash of depth and color that seemed to come from inside the surface. rather than reflecting from it. They stopped 4 meters from the core sample. The one in front crouched and looked at it for a very long time. Mara breathed. She was aware of her heart doing something complicated. She was aware of Declan's shoulder touching hers, and of the silence behind her where 9 human beings were being as still as they were capable of being, which was not very still but was, she thought, still enough. The alien reached out and placed one hand flat on the core sample. The gesture was so recognizable that she felt it in her sternum like a struck note. She had done that. She had placed her hand flat on stone thousands of times, feeling for the texture that the eye couldn't tell you, the temperature, the specific density beneath your palm. She stepped forward. 1 step. She crouched. She placed her own hand flat on the core sample beside the alien's hand. She had no idea if this was the right thing to do. She had been improvising for 11 hours on the equipment she had available, with the knowledge she had been building for 22 years, and the particular stubbornness that her field required. The stubbornness of people who spend years extracting meaningful signal from noise, who learn to trust what the data says, even when the data says something that nobody expected. She was trusting it now. She put her hand on the rock and she looked at the alien's face and she waited. The alien looked at her hand, then at her face, then at her hand again. It spoke or produced something. A series of resonances that she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. A deep structural sound like the planet itself speaking, which she later came to understand, was not metaphor but literally what she was hearing. A form of communication that used geological resonance as its carrier medium, that had probably been developed on a world where rock transmitted information more reliably than air. She could not understand it. She had made that clear in her encoded message and she said it again now, out loud, in English, knowing it was not understood. I can't hear what you're saying yet, but I'm trying. She tapped the core sample twice with 2 fingers, the way you tap rock when you're calling attention to a feature. The way she had been tapping rock her whole career. The alien was still for a moment. Then it tapped the core sample twice. Behind her, she heard Declan exhale slowly. It was not a sound of relief exactly. It was a sound she associated with the moment underground when you've been uncertain about the structure overhead, and then your instruments confirm the ceiling is solid. Not happy, exactly, but the specific quality of tension releasing from the specific location where it had been located. The ships on the horizon did not move for 7 more hours. During those 7 hours, Mara sat on the ground of Karath 9 with the core sample between herself and the alien, and she and Reyes worked, and they communicated in the only shared language they had, which was stone. She had been reading rock for 22 years and the alien had been, she estimated later, working backward from what she came to understand about the archive. Reading and writing rock for perhaps 400 years personally, part of a tradition that extended 900 million years of unbroken documentation. And there was an immense distance between those two things, an almost incomprehensible asymmetry of knowledge and time. And it did not matter. She knew the language. She had learned it her own way, for her own reasons, in her own tradition. And it was the same language in the end because the language was older than either of them. She asked, in isotopic notation, that she was becoming faster at reading and Reyes was becoming faster at encoding, what the archive was for. The alien took a long time answering and the answer was complex and she only partially translated it, but what she understood was, it was testimony. Records kept so that what had been would not be lost, so that the changes wrought by time could be witnessed, so that those who came after, whatever those who came after might be, would know what the world had been. She thought about this. Then she encoded her own response. She said, we do this too. We call it geology. The alien held the translated core sample for a long time. The resonance it produced then was different from the ones before. Shorter, simpler. A single note, held and then released. She thought, but could not be certain that it was something like laughter, or something in the territory of laughter. The particular sound you make when you encounter something you did not expect to be recognizable and discover it is. Halverson appeared beside her at some point during the 7th hour and put a sealed container of coffee in her hand and said nothing and went away again, which was exactly the right thing to do. She drank it cold. She had been drinking cold coffee for 22 years and she barely noticed anymore. The morning light of Karath 9 had moved through amber into a pale silvered mid-morning, and the long shadows had shortened, and the crew had rotated watch 3 times, and nobody had slept, and nobody had suggested sleeping. At hour 8, the alien produced something from the ship. She could not see clearly what it was at the distance. One of the other aliens brought it, and it was large and flat and heavy, and took two of them to carry. They set it on the ground between the landing ramp and the core sample, and when Mara walked close enough to see it, her steps slowed and then stopped. It was a geological cross-section. A record, cut from what she estimated was a core sample of significant depth, prepared with the same crystalline precision she had been reading in the archive, but newer. The isotopes were modern. The stratum was recent, and it showed in the same language that had been recording Careth 9's natural history for 900 million years. An event from approximately 11 months ago. The arrival of a drilling platform, the vibration patterns of a bore head, the extraction process. And then, at the top of the record, she leaned close, Reyes leaning close beside her, and she read slowly and carefully, the cessation of drilling, the placement of the core sample in the open, the line of human figures, standing in the morning light, with their shadows stretched out behind them. They had been writing it down. They had already been writing it down before the humans ever knew they were there, and they had kept writing through the morning, adding to the record in real time, the way the record had always been kept. Because witnessing mattered, because testimony mattered, because what had happened deserved to be written into the enduring medium of stone, so that those who came after would know. Mara pressed her palms flat against the record, and felt its surface, and felt something happen in her chest that she could not name and did not try to. The alien stood on the other side of the slab and placed its hands flat on the same surface, and they were separated by 3 centimeters of stone and 900 million years of a practice they had arrived at, independently, 2 species that had looked at the same thing, at deep time, at the patience of rock, at the importance of keeping the record, and had the same thought. We should write this down. In the end, the ships did not move for 11 more hours. By the time they began to lift, slowly and without drama, rising back toward their orbital positions in the manner of things that had no reason to hurry, Mara had a preliminary framework for a communication protocol, and Reyes had a 300-page transcription of the archive section they had partially extracted, and Halverson had authorized an indefinite extension of the site occupation pending reclassification of the dig from extraction to collaborative study. She was standing at the surface watching the ships go when Declan came to stand beside her again. He had taken his helmet off. He did that when he didn't feel like cargo. "You know what's going to happen next," he said. "There will be committees. There will be a lot of committees. There will be policies and frameworks and interagency working groups and preliminary findings and peer review and about 5 years of bureaucratic process before anyone officially acknowledges that we made first contact in a quarry on a rock in the outer system, because I didn't want to stop reading." Something like that. He was quiet for a moment. Was it worth it? She watched the last of the ships clear the lower atmosphere. She thought about the cross-section they had left behind, about being written into the record. An 11-month human presence inscribed in the same medium that held 900 million years of a world's history, placed there not as a warning and not as a conquest, but as testimony. "We were here, this happened, the record should reflect it. Ask me again in 5 years," she said, "after the committees." Declan made a sound that was approximately a laugh. The amber light of Careth 9's sun came in low across the excavation site and lit the bore head and the equipment and the packed earth of the working platform and the surface of the geological record where 2 handprints overlapped, one with 4 fingers and one with 5. Pressed into the same stone, different pressures, different temperatures, the same gesture. The rock would hold them both. The rock always remembered.